Hello, a very good evening to all our listeners and viewers on Chai Chat and Community by Word Palette. I'm Mallika Bhadra, and today or tonight, depending on whichever part of the world you're watching us from, I'm joined by a very special guest, and we are going to be talking and discussing about resilience and self motivation and why do we need all these things in our lives in the 21st century. But before I kind of talk to my guest and get him introduced to all of you, I would like to begin tonight's show by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting tonight, the people of the Kulin Nation. I would also like to pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. On that note, I am supremely privileged to have Dr. Kaushik Sridhar with me. Kaushik, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm well, Chris. How are you?
Not too bad. Kaushik, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself to all our listeners and audiences?
Sure. Firstly, huge thank you to you and Saleha for this really kind invitation. So my name is Kaushik. I'm based here in Sydney, Australia. I consider myself a bit of a global nomad. So born in South India, raised in Nigeria, lived in America, and now in Australia. I think that's the best way to live is have a bit of a global outlook on life.
Absolutely.
A bit about me. I don't know what's interesting about me, Chris. I used to be a professional tennis player.
Wow.
From there, I transitioned to a corporate professional. I've lectured at universities. I guess the many hats that I wear them because I like to have fun in life. So yeah, that's a quick one about me.
But of all the fun hats that you mentioned, all of them are pretty serious. Like you're lecturing and you're playing tennis. All of them are like serious feathers on the cap that you're wearing. Pretty, very inspiring, Kaushik. But the first thing that I would like to know is you have a book, right? And congratulations on that. But what
Thank you.
motivated you to write that book on self motivation? What was the inspiration?
Sure, that's a great question. So my wife was actually the first motivator for me to write the book.
Yeah.
She's from a big family from Mauritius, which is a little island nation of Africa. She came to Melbourne, I think it was like 16, 17 years ago, almost looking for something much greater than herself. Many people go to spirituality or look for motivational speakers, etc. when you're
Mm,
going through difficult times. And she
mm,
came here and still struggled, and then met me, and the outlook on life changed a little bit. And she basically said, you've got something, Koshik, in your story that maybe millions of people around the world could find some sort of a message from.
right.
So she kind of pushed me to write it. I went through an incident, Chris. So just to give your audience a very quick summary,
Sure.
I became a tennis player because not because I chose it, but because I was handpicked by a tennis academy in America. They were scouting for kids from around the world who were like the
Mm,
best of the best, and they found me in Nigeria. They basically took me away from my parents when I was 12 and a half years old. So I was a kid, a young, innocent, a naive,
mm,
protected only child. You can imagine Indian parents,
of course.
and I left them from Africa and went to the United States. And for 365 days, so every night for a whole year, six Caucasian boys, three times my size, beat me. They actually beat me like there was no tomorrow.
Mm,
Now imagine if you had a child that age, or if Saleh has a child that age, and that happened at that time. Think about what my mother would have thought 1 year
mm,
later when she found out. So that's just one incident of many incidents. I've almost died in a plane crash. I've almost died in a car crash. I've had the gun to my head three times as a kid. I have a lot of emotional and physical bullying that I've endured. In the corporate world, I experience subtle racism almost every day, whether I go to a conference or whether I go to the office. And yet, I am here in front of you having this chat today with a smile on my face and actually having no worries in the world. So, the book that I've written has 20 lessons in it.
mm,
And if you read the book, or if anyone wants to check it out, it's very different. There's already about 40 reviews on Amazon. There's already 1,300 sales. My
wow.
aim with the book was never to sell.
Mm,
My aim with the book was to, um, I guess, have an impact on one person. That's what I told my wife. I said, I'll put the effort if I can impact one person. But the messages I'm getting back, Chris, is something that I've not experienced before. It's a message of vulnerability. It's a
mm,
message of a different way of thinking. It's a message of having a thick skin, and it's a
right.
message of just getting on with it. So when you ask
Yeah.
me what motivated me to write this book, there's a lot of self-help books out there.
Mm,
Self-improvement is such a broad category when you think about it. You look
Yeah.
at personal development, you look at physical health, emotional well-being, can be relationship, career,
Yeah.
quality of life, etc. And many people, like your audience or whoever it is around the world, they're interested in this category because they, I guess, want to lead more fulfilling and satisfying
Hmm.
lives. Maybe they want to reach their full potential. Maybe they want to achieve certain goals. For me, writing this book, it allowed me to share my knowledge, my
Right.
experiences, my expertise with
Hmm.
a much broader audience. It has, like, there's no fluffy stuff in here, being
Right.
completely black and white. It's practical tips, practical strategies, tools for self improvement, how to overcome obstacles and challenges. And for me, the last bit on this question, Chris, is that when I wrote this book, it was very cathartic,
Hmm.
and it
Hmm.
helped me to reflect on my own personal growth, my own
Yeah.
development, and
Yeah.
share with others, kind of what I've learned over my journey. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Of course, more than answers, Kaushik. But I'm just kind of my heart is so full, and it's an overwhelming, and it's very inspiring when you talk about your journey. Right, you had so many pitfalls along your way. But before I move on to the other question, I want to ask you something very quickly. How do you deal with the traumatic experience? Right, obviously, on a one fine night or a day, you must have had your low moments, considering so much has happened with you. Right, how do you deal with the trauma, or how do you come up with that grief? How do you do it?
Do you mean at the age of 13 when I was going through it, Chris?
Even now when you kind of look back, and we all always look back in our lives and see that, okay, this is what has happened, blah blah blah. How do you wash away all that when it comes to you all of a sudden?
Sure. So I'll give you two answers. The
Hmm.
first answer is when I was a 13-year-old child. And
Right.
my answer is I didn't know. I
Hmm.
didn't know the meaning of the word mental health. I didn't know what the meaning of the word therapy was. I
Yeah.
didn't know anything. My parents were, thousands and thousands of kilometers away from me. I had gone here to play tennis. So if I felt that if I told anyone, I would feel I was letting people down.
Yeah.
So I kind of just kept it to myself. And
Right.
many people I've done talks around the world since I published the book. And I ask a lot of kids, what would you do if you're in my place? And they would say, many of them have said they would kill themselves, right? They would kill themselves because what I went through is quite graphic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I guess, in today's world, where you have a lot more support and a lot more opportunities to really cope and deal with these sorts of things, it's challenging. But there's a few strategies that I do talk about with some of the young people and even some of the middle-aged and older people. I think the first one is having that support system.
Right.
That
Yeah.
is absolutely integral.
Yeah.
It can be a therapist, can be your family, can be your friends.
Sure.
That can be quite beneficial.
Yeah.
I think practicing self-care,
Hmm.
it sounds really simple, but it's not that easy. You
Hmm.
to look after your physical, emotional, and mental health can
Hmm.
actually be very, very difficult. But it's actually not that difficult because when you have oxygen mask on yourself, then you can look after
Right.
others, which is a
Yeah.
saying that I really appreciate. A couple of other things that I would say, Chris. One is that I practice a lot is having a very positive mindset.
Hmm.
There are negative thoughts and negative things that will happen every day to you. You're not,
Hmm.
we're not rocks.
Hmm.
But if we are able to reframe negative thoughts into more positive ones, focus on the things that we can control, and actually practice gratitude for
Hmm.
what we do have, you'd be so surprised at how you can actually manage traumas, etc.
Right.
And the last one I would say is setting really realistic goals,
Hmm.
whether you're in the corporate world, whether it's in your personal life. Like with my wife
Yeah.
and I, we have very realistic goals. When it becomes unrealistic, that's when the problems occur. So it's very important to set that and celebrate your victories. With my
Yeah.
team, I have a team at work. I look after them. I celebrate each and every one of their victories in a very public forum. And if we can do that, that helps as well. So it's not like a one solution or one size
Yeah.
fits all.
Yeah. Yeah.
It takes time, it is a process, but it's really important that you be patient with yourself and
Hmm.
you practice a lot of self compassion along the way.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kaushik. That was a very holistic view that you provided, and thank you. They were very important words. But the next thing that I want to know is how easy you mentioned it's a time taking process of self motivation and self
Mhm.
care, but how easy or difficult it actually is, and also if someone is undergoing depression, if someone is going through a bad phase, Does that become even more difficult for that individual to practice all of what you mentioned?
It's a it's a tough question. Self motivation ain't easy.
Mm.
It ain't difficult either. It can be both easy or difficult. It depends on the factors of that person's personality or that individual's personality, their circumstances, their goals, and the level of commitment. You know, some people, like myself, I'll use myself as a case study as much as I can.
Yeah,
We're naturally self motivated and find it relatively easy to stay motivated. Others may struggle to find motivation and they need to actively work on
yeah,
developing it. Now, the process of self motivation during depression can be particularly challenging, Chris, as depression
yeah,
often affects your motivation. It
absolutely. Yeah.
affects your energy levels,
Mm.
and also the ability to experience pleasure. Individuals,
Mm.
who have depression, and I've interacted with quite a few, and especially in the last few years, they find it quite difficult to initiate and maintain motivation,
Mm.
and they kind of experience those feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. So the
Yeah.
process of self motivation during depression, that may involve setting really small, achievable goals. As I
Mm.
said earlier, breaking tasks into manageable steps,
Mm-hmm.
focusing on a lot of positive self-talk. Um, One school of thought is, and I do believe in it, it can be helpful to seek that support from a mental health professional, your
Right.
family, your friends. For me, I think the root of all of this is important to recognize that self motivation can be a very complex and challenging process, especially for people with depression. So
Mm.
you've got to seek that support, and you've got to have a plan that can help you work towards achieving, your goals and helping you kind of boost those motivation levels.
Right. Yeah, because I went through something similar a few
Mm,
years ago, and I can actually
right.
relate with what you're saying. It becomes so difficult because it's like a black hole. The more you keep getting into it, it becomes very difficult to come out of it until you are motivated. So I can exactly feel what you're saying. Kaushik, the next thing I want to know is about resilience, right?
Mhm.
We all try to be resilient around things. Life teaches us to be resilient after a few pitfalls here and there. But how do you actually build up that consistent resilience in your life towards any unpleasant or unfavorable situation that you're faced with?
Oh, this is a this question. It's a challenging one for me to answer because
Hmm.
I don't. In the book that I've written, there isn't really a manual around resilience. One of the
Right.
things that I tell a lot of um, my team, as well as some of the universities where I go and talk to students, I always say that I actually start off by saying, and this is quote unquote, I say, I'm going to tell you something that many people will be afraid to tell you.
Hmm.
And they're like, oh, what are you going to tell me? And I say, embrace failure,
Yeah.
fail, and
Yeah.
fail big.
Yeah.
Because, Chris, someone once told me that in order to have something you never had before, you need to do something you've never done before. And I fail every day. We will all fail constantly, but I think the important thing is for us to be able to brush it off, learn from it, and get back up without getting too demotivated by it. So, from a resilience perspective, if you ask me, Koshik, how do we stay resilient in today's world? And today's world it's as bad as it's been, right? I
Ah,
mean, the
yeah.
pandemic was bad enough, but
Yeah.
the world is just transforming into one thing after the other, and people are not able to just take a breath.
Right.
But
Right.
what I say is, it's a bit like how you find your purpose in life. It's
Mm.
through the common threads and your stories that you've experienced over your time. So myself, how did I build my little cloak of resilience? When someone comes to me tomorrow and says, spits in my face, Chris, I'll be able to take it. If someone comes tomorrow and slaps me in the face at work, I will be able to take it and I'll smile back. And the way that I can do that, and it's actually, there is an evidence of me dealing with those types of situations just like a few months ago.
Right.
It is through the childhood and the upbringing and the stuff you go through. So I was very
Mm.
fortunate to leave my parents at a very young age, and I had to learn to be resilient by myself.
Yeah.
I stopped learning from my family at the age of 12, and I started learning about the world from the world at the age of 13. And when six boys are standing over you
Yeah.
at 7 p.m. one night, 7 to 8 p.m., and going to town on you, it builds your resilience. When you
Yeah.
go to a conference in Australia and you're the only non-Caucasian person in that conference, and the whole room of 200 people ignore you, and then when you go on stage to speak, they realize, oops, we ignored the wrong person. That builds your little resilience.
Yeah.
So every moment that you experience that's a bit of a negative, if you can flip it into a positive, that just makes you more impervious to the future issues that might test your resilience. So that's, yeah, one piece of advice I can share.
Thanks, Kaushik. But in your previous response, you mentioned that we should learn to embrace failure. But coming
Yes.
from South Asian backgrounds, like you and I, we are both from South Asian backgrounds, right? Where we are inherently told that you have to only succeed. There is no place for failure in your life. There should be no place, right? Technically, now the narrative has been changed. But when I was growing up, or maybe you were growing up, we were
Mhm.
told you can't fail. So, how do you get that narrative to change in a young person's mind who has learned something and now he's being asked to do something else? So, how do you get people to unlearn what they've learned?
How do we get people to unlearn? That's actually a question that was asked. So in Chennai, so I'm from Chennai,
Right.
and when I went there in December, I spoke at a university, and there were about 500 to 700 kids and faculty in the
Mm.
audience. And it was really interesting because that was my first case study of the book to see if
Yeah.
it was going to have the impact that I wanted it to have. And my wife said, write this because we need to get people to be more open about the stuff that they're going through and how to find a solution. So one guy, one boy, and even one girl later on, they actually got up and said, my parents are dictating my life. Or they're
Mm.
saying all these things and they're comparing us to others, and all these sorts of
Right.
things are happening, and I'm really going mad. So how do we actually how do we deal with it? And even in Mauritius, I was talking to some kids, and one girl got up and said, I had a chance to do an internship at Goldman Sachs in New York, but my
Mm.
parents stopped me from going there because they want me just around them in Mauritius and just be around here and get
Right.
married here and do not leave. So what do we do? And I actually can't remember what I said, but I think it was something along the lines of, sometimes we just have to accept how certain generations think, right?
Mm. Mm.
Um, but this is a sentence I told my team last week when I officially resigned from my current job. I'm moving into another
Right.
job, but I knew my team would be devastated. And so what I told them was, I said, you're all grown people. Anyone above the age of 21, I think, is grown up. I'm not going to sit here and advise you on anything. But there's only one thing I'll tell you, and that is every day that you live and work and do whatever it is that you do is a day that you will never get back.
Mm.
So think about the impact you're having, what you actually want to achieve. And if you feel you're not achieving it or being happy or doing what you want to do, the only person responsible for that is not your parents, it's not me, it's not my boss, and it's not the entity, but
Yeah.
it's you.
Yeah.
You're responsible for it, so you take accountability for it. And if you are struggling with it, you leave it. But if you can accept it, you just get on with it. So I guess my practical advice for someone to unlearn something that they've learned is just unlearn it, because obviously something is not giving you joy, something is not making you feel like you're being all that you can be. So it's just your head, it's just your mind. You just got to reprogram it and say, this is not working for me, I'm going to do something else. And for me, tennis was not right for me, so I
Mm.
just unlearned it by picking something else that I thought, let me give that a shot, and if it
Yeah.
works out, great, and if it doesn't, that's okay. So it's very simple. You just have to say, I'm done with this, I'm moving on to something else.
All right, that's my mother, by the way. So my mom is
Okay.
in
Oh,
Delhi. She's
I,
saying very inspiring talk. Thanks, mom. All thanks to Kaushik.
thank
Um,
you.
Kaushik, one more question on resilience. I'm getting
No worries.
depth of questions. So questions are like coming on my mind as I hear you speak. So don't get irritated by the questions, please.
Not at all.
Um,
Don't say that.
so you talked about resilience, right? So often I've seen, like back in South Asia, some people there are two kinds people emerge, I think. Some people get very hardened, they take it on as the challenges come, and some people unfortunately succumb to it. We've heard so many suicide rates, people just ending their lives of some pressure they're
Mm,
unable to take, whether it's board exams or
mhm.
professional challenges. What would you like to tell them who are on the, on the verge of depression, who are feeling suicidal just because they could not build that resilience in their lives?
As I said earlier, everyone's got a story, right?
Yeah,
If you could, you would interview someone on your podcast every day because there's so many people out there with interesting stories, some good and some not so good.
yeah, yeah.
I guess my feedback to people who are feeling a bit of pressure and kind of slipping into that
Mm,
mode of depression
yeah.
is to actually take a stock of their life today. Now, I'm going to be a little bit harsh, um, but I don't want to compromise on how I communicate, which is the
Sure.
reason I was asked by many people to write this book. Maybe I should do this with an example, might be softer. So, my wife last week was, you know, she was feeling pressure from something
Yeah.
and was slipping into some old habits. And so what I said was, all right, let's take a look across the planet into Syria. Let's take a look across the planet into Turkey. Let's take a look at even from my own hometown in the slums of Chennai or Mumbai or wherever it is, or your home country of Mauritius. Now there are pockets of excellence in this world, and there are pockets of sadness in this world. Where do you think you stand at the moment, living in a little home in Sydney, having a very privileged life, and having everything you want, which is not, I mean, the solution for not being depressed, because depression comes from a root cause of something. So my point to her was, let's take a stock of today. What's actually giving you that depression? Is it the immediate needs, or is it something that's deeply rooted somewhere with family or with a traumatic episode when you were a
Yeah.
child? And so it's all about perspectives, Chris. I think if it's an exam pressure, is it the exam pressure, or is it something related to the parents and the family? Because that's a whole different kettle of fish. And my feedback to make this all positive is to actually tell people to think about what is the subtitle of my book, which is what's the worst that could happen, right?
Mm,
If what's the worst that could happen is not that bad, then why worry about it? Because by worrying about it, you're not really living in the present. Like
mm,
for me, in COVID, I lost my job, Chris. So here's a little story to put perspective. February 2020, the pandemic hit this world.
yeah.
March 2020, my father went into ICU for something much worse than COVID, right? And my mom is sort of disabled, so I'm an only child. This is just 2020, right? In April, I was supposed to go back and care for them, and all flights got canceled around the world. In
Mm,
May 2020, from my dream job, I was given 2 days' notice to pack my bags and get out. Single income household. My wife doesn't work. She has health issues. Now, you tell me, what should I do in that position that I'm in?
yeah.
August 2020, August 2020, I got a job that doubled my salary at a time when companies were not hiring. But that's not the fun bit. The fun bit is what happened between May and August, which is when my wife said, you have to write this because it was the 5 best professional months of my career. And you wouldn't believe if I told you. So it's all about perspective and how do you reprogram your head? Because from every dire situation, something positive will always come out. Will always come out. You just have to be patient, and you just have to bide your time. And you should always ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen? I say this to my parents. I say this to people who think they know everything. People in their 50s and 60s and their 70s, they're all knowing, that generation, which is great. They know some stuff, but they don't know a
Yeah.
lot of things. Same
Yeah.
like us. So
Agreed.
when they come and stress or advice or whatever they want to say, I just sit back and think, how do I deal with this? And then I ask the question, what's the worst that could happen? So whether it's a marriage, whether it's a happy thing in your life or a sad thing in your life, stress will always come. But it's all about asking yourself, what's the worst that could happen? And if it's not that bad, just be happy and get on with life.
Thank you, Kaushik. I think my mom says that last sentence exactly the way you said it. Like every time I'm whinging about it, she'll be like, "Look at other people and look at where you are. So just be happy with it." So I can very well understand where you come from, Kaushik, but very, very inspiring. And we have obviously a comment from Salia. She says, "Hats off to you, Kaushik," which is actually true. Hats
Thanks,
off to you.
Aleha.
I'm mindful of the time, Kaushik, but I have a few
Sure.
questions for you. Um, you know, talking about feedback, we all look at feedbacks in our life. We sometimes want to have feedback because of various things you're doing, right? Like, for example, I run a podcast, so I'm always looking for feedback. But in general life, how do you draw a line between feedback and criticism? And how do you go about dealing with them?
Yes, these questions are so much fun. Um, so learning to draw a line between feedback and criticism, this can be very challenging, I think. But if your question is how do you draw the line, I think there's a few opportunities that we have. I think the first thing is actually understanding the difference between feedback and criticism.
Yeah.
Criticism is negative
Mm.
feedback that attacks you or
Yeah.
is intended to hurt you,
Mm.
whereas feedback is actually given to help you to improve or grow, right? Which is
Mm.
what you expect in a corporate setting or any setting. Actually, I
Yeah.
think
Funny
that's
setting.
how it
Yeah.
should
Yeah.
be.
Mm.
I think look at the intention behind the feedback.
Mm.
If feedback is given to you with good intentions, it's really meant to improve, whereas criticism is really meant to hurt or bring you down, as I said earlier. Focus on the message, not the delivery.
Mm.
So feedback can really be delivered in a very positive or negative way, but it's important to focus on that message of what that person is trying to say. And I don't necessarily think the way that it's delivered to you. If you look
Mm.
at criticism, criticism is generally delivered in more or less one way, right? Quite an
Mm.
attacking way. A couple of other things I would say in terms of the opportunities is think about the source of the
Yeah.
feedback. If you're getting it from someone that you really trust and respect, whatever it might be, it can be quite helpful. Whereas if it's coming from someone that doesn't have your best interests at heart and trying to bring you down, that can be an issue. Time. When you get feedback, like take time to process it rather than responding to it instantly.
Mm.
When you take the time to process the feedback, you are actually determining whether it's helpful or harmful. And this is something, Chris, that I practice every day because I fail every day and I get feedback every day. And it's that delineation, that blurred line between feedback and criticism, which is where I just take the time, even if it's coming from someone I don't trust. Sometimes there's the expression, keep your friends close, your enemies closer. So there
Yeah.
is some words of wisdom that I always take from enemies and from others, that may not have my best interests in their mind. So taking that time really helps my reaction, in a very emotionally intelligent way, I hope. And probably the last one I would say is, that self reflection, which is another thing I practice a lot. Your own SWOT, your own strengths, your own weaknesses, your own
Mm.
opportunities, your own threats, and being open to feedback that can help you
Yeah.
improve. So I think, yeah, absolutely. Feedback and criticism, sometimes it's really hard to see the difference, but if you can see the
Mm.
source, if you can see, what's being said, etc., I think that'll help you like
Just draw the
deviate more
line.
towards, yeah,
Yeah.
where you want to go to.
Um, I'll come to your point of self-reflection in a little bit, Kaushik, but I have another
No
question about
worries.
when you said that criticism is mostly in a partially negative way, that it's not fully constructive. But then, in that way, if I'm looking at it from another perspective, does criticism help us become more resilient?
Yeah. uh, it does. It does. That's a really good point. Um, yeah. So it depends on how thick your skin is. So when I was 15 years old in Texas,
Yeah.
my coach took me into a room. He spat on my face. He spit on my face, and he basically said, "You will amount to nothing in this world. You will amount to nothing." Right? At that time, that was kind of a bit of a criticism,
Yeah.
but it might have also been kind of a bit of a feedback. Maybe I was doing something wrong, or maybe I just, whatever the issue was, I don't know. Um, but you're spot on, Chris. I think you're 100% accurate in that some criticism I think even within criticisms, there are degrees. So
Yeah.
some criticism, I think the harsher it is, the tougher it makes you if you're able to channel it in the right way.
Yeah.
But if you're not able to channel it in the right way,
Then
quite
it's not gonna
deadly.
happen. Yeah.
Yeah,
Can be
good point.
disaster.
Very good point.
Thank you, Kaushik. And all right, two more questions, and I promise I'll wrap up. The next thing that I
No
want to
worries.
know from you is you talked about self reflection, right, Kaushik? And I wanted to know is
Mhm.
do you think introspection or self reflection is healthy so that we can rectify our mistakes in life? And if not, then how do we develop a positive mindset towards the mistakes that we might have committed in the past?
Sure. So introspection, I think it's important we approach that, Chris, with a balanced and non-judgmental mindset. Now, it's natural that we make mistakes, we have regrets in life,
Yeah,
but when we dwell on it too much,
yeah,
it can lead to quite a lot of negative self-doubt, self-talk, etc. So it's really important that we acknowledge our mistakes. As I
mm,
said earlier, we learn from them, and we move forward with a very positive attitude and trying to focus on our own personal growth.
right.
So I think when you ask about introspection and how healthy is it, and how do we develop that positive mindset, it's not that different to some of the things that I said earlier, which is around practicing self-compassion. Treat yourself with the same level of kindness and understanding that you would offer someone else that remind yourself that everyone makes mistakes, and really it's a natural part of the learning process.
Mm,
I think learning from your mistakes, as I said earlier, it's a great opportunity to learn from and grow.
yeah,
It's important that you reflect on what went wrong
yeah,
and what you could do differently in the future. And I think, as I said earlier, again, and you can see when I'm saying similar things, it's actually not that complicated.
mm,
There are some fundamental things that we can do to just manage the whole situation,
yeah, yeah,
and practicing gratitude. It is this is it's this needs to be done so much more in this world, because we're so quick to move on to the next thing and to the next thing and to the next thing. But if we can focus on the positive aspects of our life, the people around us, their life, things that we enjoy doing, the accomplishments we're really proud of, like I'm doing this podcast. For me, this is a proud moment for me. I don't care if you have an audience of one or if you have an audience of 1,000. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is I'm in this time with you, Chris, for 30 minutes. And I'm so happy to be doing this with you. And I'm grateful for this opportunity. And that is pretty wholehearted, right? And I'm sure saying that probably, hopefully, means something to you and
yeah.
means something to your community. And if we all did that collectively in that moment, imagine how even a little bit different life could be. So I think that's a key one.
Amazing. And it's an absolute honor for me to be hosting you, Kaushik, and all thanks to Salia for giving me that opportunity. But one last thing, Kaushik, you and I are both in very privileged situations. We're in Sydney,
Mhm,
I'm in Melbourne, right? There are heaps of
mhm.
South Asians in that pocket of the world who do not probably understand a lot of things, what they should be doing to kind of make their lives richer and full of gratitude. So, what would be your message to anybody who's listening to you from that part of the world?
Sure. So I think the theme we discussed today was quite a lot. It started with self-improvement. And I'm not perfect. No one is perfect, and we're always continuously on this self-improvement journey. Whether we're in Sydney, whether we're in Chennai, whether we're in Nigeria, whether we're rich, whether we're poor, we're always trying to improve ourselves. So I guess my key message here tonight, is that this is a journey that requires patience,
Yeah,
persistence, and a willingness to learn and grow. It's very important here to remember, Chris, that self improvement isn't about becoming perfect, but rather about becoming the best version of
yeah,
yourself. So if there's five things, key takeaways for your audience, wherever they are and whoever they are, I think the first one is setting realistic goals for yourself. I always say, what is it? Under promise and over deliver, not over promise and under deliver. That's really important. So set very realistic goals, because then it's more achievable and you can be more proud of yourself. Stay motivated. You've got to find inspiration from somewhere. There's some very inspiring stories of some very tragic situations where people have remained motivated. So I think it's not that hard. We just need to do it. The third one would be to embrace failure. It's okay to fail. It's part of the self improvement process. Instead of beating yourself up, try to learn and grow. Um, be kind to yourself. Look after yourself. Look after yourself. Like really look after yourself. Pamper yourself. Make yourself your priority. Um, and the last one is, to remember that self improvement is a personal journey. So never compare yourself to others or get discouraged by any steps back. You got to focus on your achievements and your progress, no matter how small or big it might be. Even if it's small, that's totally cool. So I would say, like, if you had that as a bit of a starting point, it'll be very hard for you to be down or for anyone to put you down. Yeah,
Golden words, Kaushik. Like I'm super super inspired, and I'm like in awe of what I've just heard in these 36 minutes from you.
thank
But
you.
all thanks to you for coming on the platform and sharing your amazing journey. So, to all our listeners and audience, this was Dr. Kaushik Sridhar from Sydney. He spoke about his amazing journey on self motivation, resilience, taking care of ourselves. So, please, I hope that you've had a lot to take away from his journey. And I would also like to mention, if any of you is undergoing through a difficult time, or you feel that you are in depression, please seek out help and therapy. We will be also mentioning a few numbers and websites you can refer to under this video. And we're living in crazy times. Take care and stay safe. And we'll be back shortly with another conversation on Chai Chat and Community. Thank you, Kaushik. A very good evening. Thank you again.
Thanks, Chris.